Welcome back, everyone, as we take a look at the final part of the First War of Scottish Independence that we haven't previously looked at. As I mentioned at the beginning of this series, the video on the Battle of Bannockburn is one that HistoryMarche had done a while back, and we've already done the reaction to that one. So this will be the last part that I'll be releasing, and at the end I will give you the link to my reaction to the Battle of Bannockburn, which is the next part of this. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Battle of Loudon Hill, which, if you've heard me repeatedly talking about the Netflix movie Outlaw King, starring Chris Pine as Robert the Bruce, the climax of that movie is the Battle of Loudon Hill, mostly true to kind of the concept of what happens there. Version of that, though they portray King Edward II as being present, and he was not present at that battle. This was led by Valence instead. So we're going to take a look at the real history of this. As always, a link's in the description if you want to check it out without my commentary, and the link to the very first part of this series if you haven't seen my reaction to this point. Let's dive in.
The year of 1298 had witnessed the humbling of William Wallace, less than a year after his initial triumph at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. However, the defeat of Wallace's Chilterns at Falkirk was far from decisive, with even Wallace himself escaping the slaughter. Yet even as the battered Kingdom of Scots entered its fourth year of war with England, another hero had already made moves to position himself as a great champion of his people. The famed future Scots king Robert the Bruce was born in 1274 during the years of peace and prosperity under King Alexander III.
So it's great to consider the context here then. So when William Wallace is the guardian of Scotland, Robert the Bruce is just in his early 20s. He's still pretty young.
Robert was the son of Robert de Bruce, the 6th Lord of Annandale, who was himself the son of Robert the Competitor, later rival of John Balliol, for the then vacant throne of Scots.
So this is great here because this really shows us why it is that John Balliol and Robert the Bruce have kind of competing claims to the throne, right? Because they're both coming through a female line. The line of Scottish kings had gone through William, Alexander, and then of course we begin this whole story with Margaret dying as a child, just 3 years old. And so now things go over all the way back up to her great-great-grandfather's brother, David. And then, of course, he had a son who died the same year as him. And so it's only female lines that are left as the senior lines to the throne. So John Balliol is the senior line in this case because he comes from Margaret, who's an older sister. But at that point, when you're not dealing with a real strong, real clear-cut line to the throne, it's whoever has the power and the authority can grab it.
In 1292, the Bruces had seemingly lost their chance of kingship with Edward Longshanks's election of John as king. Robert and his family naturally sided with Edward as he heaped pressure on the Scots to support him financially and militarily in his wars as Scotland's overlord. In the event, John's short reign proved unsuccessful, the nobles in his kingdom seizing control by 1295 and forming an alliance with France, King Edward's greatest enemy.
And at this point, if John Balliol's not the king, then, Robert the Bruce seems like the natural successor, but it's not quite that clear cut because, again, at this point, who's powerful, who's got the influence, who can unite the country? And there's still some competition there.
1296 set the seal on Balliol's failure as a monarch, Edward himself having John ritually stripped of the crown and occupying the kingdom after a brief struggle. Documents ominously began to refer to the land of Scotland as opposed to a kingdom, and now the throne was effectively vacant with Balliol's exile. It may have been around this time that Robert began to seriously reignite his own family's ambitions for the throne. As the summer of 1297 approached, the Bruces remained rooted in their English allegiance. Having heard of the defection of Sir William Douglas to Wallace's cause, King Edward sent word to Carlisle for the elder Bruce to send his son north to raise the men of Annandale and seize Douglas's castle. Robert dutifully obliged, though en route he had a change of heart. At Douglas Castle, the young Bruce gathered his men about him and said, "No man holds his flesh and blood in hatred, and I am no exception. I must join my own people and the nation in which I was born. Choose then whether you go with me or return to your homes." Many of the knights present chose the latter, feeling a stronger influence in their pledges to King Edward, and that their lord, the elder Bruce, also still held to his alliance, and thus departed.
It's no easy thing to do what is right, or at least what you feel is right, in the face of a lot of other competing factors, right? Survival is a strong instinct. No matter how much you might want Scotland to be free of English rule, if you just don't think it's possible, survival is a strong instinct, and you're going to stick to what's going to keep you alive and what's going to keep you fed and what's going to keep you in control of your own lands.
Robert, however, marched northeast through his own domain of Carrick, recruiting as he went, and later joined the steward and Bishop Wishart at Irvine. Irvine proved a dismal false start for Bruce's own intentions. As a formidable force of armoured knights under Percy and Clifford approached, dissension in the overall resistance crumbled the rebel resolve. Unlike Wallace and Andrew de Moray, both fighting their own campaigns elsewhere, James Stewart, Robert Wishart, and others considered the Balliol claim dead, given John's unkinging the year before. Facing a powerful force disunited with their own army of mostly footmen, cracked the resolve of the rebels at Irvine. On 9th of July 1297, the Bruce, along with the other leaders, agreed to surrender to King Edward's peace, though Robert did not hand over his infant daughter as hostage, remaining in rebellion and deprived of his lands. As for the elder Bruce, he was deprived of his governorship of Carlisle and retired to his English lands until his death in 1304.
So yeah, great point there, because you might wonder, for example, and you see in the movie Braveheart, you see Robert the Bruce's father is present for a big part of that. And that was true. I mean, he's around until, 1304? So just a couple of years before Robert is going to win his victory at Loudon Hill, his father's still alive. And so his father's obviously the greater claimant to the throne. Now, I think he had leprosy. And interestingly enough, when Robert the Bruce himself dies a few decades later, he's going to die of leprosy. So I looked it up because I found myself thinking, I'm not 100% sure on this whole leprosy thing. I knew I had read it. Most of the sources that say Robert the Bruce, he was like in his mid-50s when he died of leprosy, are coming from England and are obviously biased toward wanting to make him look bad. And it seems like there's no contemporary Scottish evidence that he had leprosy, and they've actually got like a heel bone that was not reburied with Robert when he was exhumed at one point, and they've been able to examine that, and they said there's no evidence of leprosy. So really, it's unclear what he actually died of, but I'm getting ahead of myself anyway.
During Wallace's short-lived wave of success, it was Robert who dubbed him a knight in his base of Selkirk Forest and supported his being made guardian of Scotland by his own and a collective agreement of all the lords, bishops, and leaders present. Following Falkirk, the Bruce himself was made joint guardian of the realm with his great rival John Comyn of Badenoch, also known as the Red Comyn. The Comyn family had been staunchly loyal to the Balliol claim, proving a colossal obstacle to any Bruce claim, holding extensive lands and power beyond the Tay. Falkirk was a stinging defeat, but hardly a signal of full conquest.
So really what you're dealing with here is a situation where, we've been saying it all along, Scotland, to have a chance to win, has to be united. And it's never going to be united. It goes back, Lincoln quoted the Bible when he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And that's the case here. It will either have to be, as Lincoln said, it'll either have to cease being divided, or it won't be able to stand. So Scotland's either going to stay under English rule or they're going to have to cease to be divided. And that means one of these guys is going to have to go.
Edward simply did not have the numbers to fully occupy the land. His control concentrated in the southeast. In Scotland, the civil government continued, though the fragile alliance soon disintegrated, Bruce resigning his post in 1300. Though Edward could not prevent the loss of Stirling Castle in 1299, he continued to campaign during his last years, the English army invading the southwest from Carlisle in 1300. Both Edward and his heir, Edward of Carnarvon, invading in 1301, and Edward also marching as far north as Kinloss Abbey.
Notice how he stays along the coast, right? Easier to supply, either by sea or by land. Lower terrain, you're getting up into the highlands here. So he's going up and around because you've got, there's so many advantages to doing it that way.
In 1303. On the 22nd of April 1304, Edward initiated the siege of Stirling Castle. In March of the same year, John Comyn and around 100 Scots nobles formally swore homage and fealty to Edward. The surrender of the kingdom's leading men and the loss of the key castle of Stirling was not the limit of an independent Scotland's ill fortune, as in August of 1305, the victor of Stirling Bridge himself was captured.
So, as I keep mentioning the movie Outlaw King, this is about where you're picking up, right? The fall of Stirling Castle. The homage being paid to Edward by men like Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. The capture of William Wallace and his later execution.
Eventually suffering the horrific sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Wallace's head was set above London Bridge, his body butchered and displayed in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. Meanwhile, a shred of hope for a united front against the English emerged in the summer of 1305. Clandestine negotiations between the Red Comyn and Bruce produced a shaky agreement premised on the understanding that one should receive the estates of the other in exchange for one of them becoming king. At the time, Edward was seriously ill in England, and in the event would never set foot in Scotland again, which perhaps reinforced the urgency of an agreement. Edward's recovery may have caused Comyn to rethink his position. The whole matter was brutally concluded at the infamous meeting at Greyfriars Monastery on February 10th, 1306. Bruce accused Comyn of treachery, causing the two men to come to blows despite being on sacred ground.
Yeah, and this is a big deal. The reason they're meeting in the church is because it was perceived to be like there were lines you just didn't cross. And one of the lines you did not cross was to shed blood in the house of God on sacred ground. They took this very, very seriously. So this could be seen as like an unforgivable act worthy of excommunication to kill someone on sacred ground. But Robert the Bruce gets lucky on this one.
Near the high altar, the confrontation ended with Robert stabbing his rival to death, though it was possible a retainer actually finished Comyn off. The gravity of the murder was huge. Robert had killed one of the most powerful men in Scotland in a church, a highly sacrilegious act, an act which would have severe consequences later on. Now all in on his path to the crown, Robert captured Dumfries Castle.
So Robert has eliminated his greatest rival in terms of uniting Scotland, but the nature in which he does it, and it may or may not have been planned out. My guess is it probably wasn't. Things escalated and it just came to that. Because I don't think Robert would have planned to kill him that way, because he had to know what the consequences would be. But it made his job of uniting the country much, much harder.
The Bruce moved quickly, riding to the bishops William Lamberton and Robert Wishart, who, though supportive, likely viewed Bruce's action to seize the throne untimely, as their greatest threat in Edward Longshanks still lived and would inevitably move to destroy them.
He absolves him, and this is the key. If the church had not absolved Robert the Bruce of this, he's done. And who knows what happens with Scotland at that point. But Glasgow Cathedral, you can go there to this day. Some of those scenes where this stuff happens, where Robert the Bruce submits himself to the church authorities and they absolve him of that, and then he stands and then they kneel to recognize him as their king. That was actually filmed in Glasgow Cathedral, which is where Wishart is buried. And so then they set up the crowning of Robert the Bruce at Scone, and now he's got to set about the job of uniting the country, and it won't be easy.
The bishop fully threw his support behind him by formally absolving him of Comyn's murder. Bruce's endorsement by the church may on the surface appear odd, given such an egregious act. However, Scotland's leading clergymen had always proved a solid bulwark of resistance to what they perceived as inevitable English dominion over them, if Edward's designs for a Wales North succeeded.
Remember, at this point in history, the church is incredibly powerful and influential. And you're going to have a very difficult time, Robert the Bruce is, in uniting the country without the full support of the church. So that's one step in this process. That gives him legitimacy in the eyes of the common people, but he's still got to win over the nobles.
On 25th of March 1306, Robert the Bruce was crowned King Robert I of Scotland in Scone. The ailing Edward Longshanks was furious with the news and sent his lieutenant Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, as well as his son Edward to punish the errant Bruce. Prince Edward infamously marched under the dragon banner, flown to indicate that the usual rules of chivalry were suspended, and so Robert could expect no mercy.
Some people commented previously and asked me about that stuff you see in the movie Outlaw King about the dragon banner. Is that true? Absolutely true. This was a sign that said, because here's how normally it works, right? In chivalry, you fight a battle, you capture noblemen afterwards. They're treated with respect for the most part. But in certain times of very difficult war, especially in civil wars, especially in dynastic wars, a lot of times that stuff goes out the door, right? Perfect example of that is going to be the Battle of Agincourt, when you're going to have Henry V, the King of England, very famously executing a bunch of prisoners at the end of that battle, a bunch of French prisoners. Normally you wouldn't do that kind of thing. And we're going to see, this is going to get nasty. Robert the Bruce is going to have several of his relatives, including some brothers, are going to be killed terribly. His wife's going to be captured. It's going to get really, really nasty.
Valence quickly established his camp at Perth by June, with his army drawn from men of the northern counties, making up a sizable 3,000 men. As might be expected, Pembroke's host was eagerly supplemented by Comyn's supporters. King Robert, though, was not idle, and moved with around 4,500 men to confront Valence in Perth on June 18th. There demanding the Earl came out and do battle. Unfortunately for him, it's likely King Robert had not heard news of Edward's raising of the dragon banner, or his declaration of him as an outlaw, significantly changing the context of any encounter.
Right, so there's certain rules of war that they would observe, and because they've raised the dragon banner, all that's out the door. So Robert the Bruce has a certain expectation about how this is going to go, and Valence is like, forget that. And the Bruce gets, like a lot of people do when they're first taking leadership, right? This is going to be his first battle as king, Robert the Bruce. You have to learn on the job. Unfortunately for Robert, he's going to learn a very important lesson that nearly costs him everything.
Pembroke answered by denying the offer of battle, claiming it was too late in the day, and that they would fight on the morrow. The Bruce knew Pembroke as an honourable man, and accepted, withdrawing his own force into the woods near Methven, trusting to the rules of engagement, and not posting scouts.
Mistake.
That same evening, Pembroke attacked, his force containing large numbers of archers and cavalry.
Because here's the thing. Look, this is one of those rare times when the Scottish army actually outnumbers the English. There's less than 3,000 men. Bruce has got 4,500. In a pitched battle, he's probably got a good chance, but he's going to get outsmarted.
The Scots, who were largely dispersed, unarmed and unarmoured, proved unequal to Pembroke's men. The royal army fought ferociously to barely enable their king to flee. Robert himself was said to have personally unhorsed Pembroke during the melee, but was in turn himself unhorsed 3 times before making his escape. Most of Robert's army were not so lucky. Of the 4,500 men who fought at Methven, some 4,000 were either slain or taken captive.
Whole army's gone.
This heavy defeat was only compounded with another hard blow struck by the MacDougall clan, Comyn loyalists, at the Battle of Dalray, further reducing Robert's following. This opening few months of Robert's reign proved the nadir of his fortunes. News soon reached him that Prince Edward had seized Kildrummy Castle, commanded by his brother Neil. Neil held out for a time. This action initially enabled the Bruce's womenfolk to escape north to Tain. However, the Earl of Ross, a Comyn sympathiser, sent his men to capture them, sending them south into English captivity. Throughout the winter, he waited off the mainland, possibly on the island of Arran. Such a catastrophic reversal would have broken any ordinary man.
Yeah, I mean, think about this. At this point, he's gone from being crowned King of Scotland, leading an army of 4,500 men, to having a couple of dozen men with him. His brother has been killed. His wife and daughter are in captivity. It's a nightmare scenario. I don't know why I said his daughter. He didn't have a daughter that was there. That was his wife, though, Elizabeth de Burgh.
Yet, in true Alfredian style, Robert planned his comeback. Given his small numbers, he couldn't hope to win a conventional war against the English. Dalray also proved he had troubles enough with domestic enemies too. Therefore, Bruce decided to take on the latter first. At Loch Ryan, Alexander and Thomas Bruce were both defeated by the men of Dungal MacDougall and later executed.
So now, 3 brothers of Robert the Bruce are dead. I mean, this is about as low as you can get if you're Robert. I mean, you've got to have some real intestinal fortitude to pull yourself out of all of this.
Foray into Galloway cut brutally short, the Bruce finally met with success in his own invasion of Annandale, where he could count on strong local support. Evading a local English garrison, Bruce scored his first minor victory at Turnberry, defeating the men of Henry de Percy in the outskirts of the castle, eventually forcing Percy's withdrawal. Aymer de Valence soon moved to counter him, likely aware of the king's small numbers and hoping to pin down and crush him. Robert's capture would hopefully snuff out Scottish resistance for good. The Bruce, though, also knew this, and so wisely chose carefully where to confront his enemy. In April of 1307, this approach proved fruitful. Valence received intelligence that the Bruce was based at the head of Glentrool, and perhaps wanting to repeat his tactic of surprise, moved in for the kill.
So, we've talked about this before. What do you do if you're heavily outnumbered and you're facing an invading army? Well, you dictate the terms of the engagement. You draw him as far from his base of supply and support as possible. You create every possible means by which you can reduce his advantage in numbers. You narrow the place in which he can attack, right? Just like at Stirling Bridge, you've got that narrow bridge. So he's going to use all of these things to his advantage here.
The area was basically a narrow track with a steep slope overlooking it, and down which Pembroke sent his cavalry.
Another great example, I mean, you think of something like the stand of the Spartans and the other Greeks at Thermopylae, right? Narrow area, massive army that's invading, that can't bring its numbers to bear on you.
Robert sent his own men up the slope, having them loosen rocks and boulders down onto the English, inflicting heavy casualties. This barrage was followed by deadly volleys from the Bruce's archers, and maybe even a general charge, which caused Pembroke's general withdrawal. Glentrool boosted the morale of the Bruce's followers, yet did not diminish Pembroke's resolve as he pursued the king to Loudon Hill. Up to this point, Robert had fought small guerrilla-type engagements, but now chose to fight a potentially ruinous pitched battle, despite being heavily outnumbered and with arguably inferior men. The Bruce had next to no cavalry, while the Earl of Pembroke's 3,000 troops were almost exclusively horse. However, this number and value imbalance was lessened by Robert's clever use of terrain. He deployed his men on elevated land, flanked by boggy ground, with some woods guarding his rear and to the right of the advancing English. These natural features served the purpose of funneling the English assault into a single predictable direction.
Right, again, narrow the front by which he can attack. You're outnumbered like 4, 5, 6 to 1, something like that at this battle, plus the quality of your troops isn't as good. You play rock, paper, scissors, right? He's going to lead with his cavalry. You play with your best anti-cavalry force. You bog down the terrain so they can't charge at you. You dig ditches, you make pikes, and then you hold on.
Robert formed his infantry into schiltrons, well suited to facing Valance's probable cavalry charges. Robert also had his men dig trenches. The result was nothing short of a medieval car crash in which men, horse, and cold steel meshed into a bloody and muddled mess. The battle, though, was still hard fought, with King Robert himself, along with his brother Edward and the Black Douglas, leading his men in melee. After several hours, the schiltrons continued to hold, and with no possibility of flanking the stubborn Scots, Pembroke ordered a withdrawal.
It's a great point he makes about this being several hours. We get the idea from watching movies and TV shows that these battles happen quickly. They don't. Great example, if you've ever watched Band of Brothers and you see the very famous attack on Foy, or Foix as it's pronounced over there in Belgium. They show an attack that appears to take 10, 15 minutes of a TV show, but it was like a 6.5 hour battle. You know, they have to condense things for the sake of telling a story on screen. But this is hours of fighting. Imagine how exhausted you are from hours of hand-to-hand combat. This is a real battle of willpower and who wants it more.
King Robert's victory at Loudon Hill was an unambiguous defeat for the English, inflicting hundreds of casualties and, more importantly, confirming Robert the Bruce as the nexus of Scots resistance to English domination. The Bruce's cause was only enhanced soon after by the death of his greatest threat, King Edward Longshanks, on July 7th, which saw the crown of England and Longshanks' ambitions pass on to his untested heir.
And Edward did indeed leave instructions that he wanted them to boil his body and carry his bones at the head of the army in conquering Scotland, and it wasn't to be.
Edward of Carnarvon. Loudon Hill arguably marked the true turning point of the First War of Scottish Independence, though the Scots would have to grind on for several more years before reducing the English presence in their land down to a handful of castles, though by 1307, King Robert was already set on the glorious road to his greatest triumph at Bannockburn.
Yep. All right, so I'll throw up the link here at the end on the end screen if you want to check out my reaction I did a while back to the Battle of Bannockburn. Fascinating battle, really interesting, and there's a lot to be learned, and they do a great job telling the story of that. So check it out. Let me know your thoughts, and I am catching up with recording a couple of things ahead of time because I am off to Tennessee tomorrow. Hope to meet some of you there. Thanks for watching.